What's the best habit you could take on right now to speed up your progress on the guitar? It's practicing with a metronome. Join me today and find out why a metronome could radically change your progress on the guitar. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome, friends, to episode 147 of the Play Guitar Podcast. I'm Lee, and this is the podcast that's determined to make you a better guitar player. No matter if you're just starting out or you've been playing for years, this is the show that will help you become the guitarist that you always wanted to be. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and check out the description for all of the links from the show. Have you ever said, I hate practicing with the metronome? It feels cold, it's unforgiving, it's stale, it's lifeless. Well, if you haven't, I'm sure you felt the difference between jamming with a few other players and practicing along to a metronome. Yep, it's different. It doesn't have that human vibe to it. It's not listening to you, and it doesn't care what you do. I have another question for you. Have you ever heard a performer who had rock solid timing? They had rhythm so good it just made you want to move. How does that happen? Is it just a gift, or is there a way to train yourself to have great rhythm? 100% there is a way, and that tool that left you cold and stale, it's the doorway to changing your life as a performer. But in my opinion, the metronome, it's not for performing. It's not a performance machine. In fact, one of my most uncomfortable times performing was it was in a church band that played everything to a click, to a metronome. And it created a feel that's just like how you originally thought a metronome, your initial reaction to the metronome. It was cold and stale and lifeless. For better or for worse, when you're performing to a click, you're locked in. But how about a what if here? What if everyone in the band had great internal time, had a great internal metronome? What if every member in the band had a great sense of time? What could happen then without a metronome? Well, the group could make decisions of things to do with the main timing of the song. They could start and stop the song mid-song to add some tension. They could make adjustments to the tempo on the fly based on the audience or based on an effect that would set the song off just right. This, to me, is the best way to use a metronome to train yourself to have rock solid time. I feel that the object isn't to perform to a machine, it's to practice with, to give you internal time. So when the time comes to perform, you are good to go when it's not there. So let's go ahead and get into the second installment of my Making the Most of Your Practice Time series with using a metronome. And make sure you stay around till the end for my bonus metronome guide that gives you examples of how to own the rhythm of your favorite scales, licks, and chord progressions. Okay, why use a metronome? Well, the obvious answer is that it helps you keep the beat, the timing of songs, keeps everything steady. A metronome, whether it's a digital one or one of the old ones where it rocks back and forth, it's meant to give you an audible guide to a certain speed that's measured. It's measured in beats per minute. Music's all about matching things together. We match scales to chords, but we also need to match our rhythms to an overall master speed to keep a steady rhythm and keep everyone who's playing together. But what happens when you're not sticking to a steady tempo? Things will start to sound off. I've always mentioned to my students that when you're playing for an audience, rhythm is the thing that can make or break you. Most audiences are not filled with musicians. They've got normal, everyday people. And they may not have a trained ear for music. They just have a feeling. They feel whether they like the song or not. One of the things we always worry about is playing and singing in tune. And this is really important. But when you're playing for a general audience, very few listeners could actually tell if something's slightly out of tune. But every one of them would instantly know if someone got off beat. And why is that? Well, it's because of something we all have in common. Hopefully, we all have a pulse. I've talked about this before. When it comes to our heart, our brain acts like a metronome. It sets the tempo of our pulse, and it changes it for the circumstances that we happen to be in at the time. We're all very familiar with the rhythm. So for the person who's starting to play out and spending a great amount of time on your rhythm, this is super beneficial. So let's talk about the common timing problems that musicians faced. The first problem that we have is rushing. That's speeding up the beat. This is one I hear most. This is when you force the song to go faster by playing notes way too early. Too much of this and the solid, even timing of the song gets lost, and you find yourself struggling to get all of your notes in when they're supposed to be. Happens a lot when you play faster rhythms too. 8th notes, 16th note, 32nd notes, that you tend to rush those. And one of the main reasons I see when players rush, it's excitement. When the adrenaline kicks in, it's very difficult to stay contained to a slower tempo when you're excited. It's natural once speed things up. The other common timing problem that musicians face is dragging, slowing down the beat. And I don't find this to be as common as rushing, but dragging happens a lot with new players that aren't sure where to place their notes, where to place them on the beat at all. And this can make a song sound kind of lazy and tired, and it's very noticeable. But when you practice with a metronome, it helps you play well with others. The more you play to a solid, steady time, the more familiar you are with what a solid tempo should sound like. You get used to it. Your brain starts to rely on it, and it develops around it. It's pretty easy to go into a band and be a follower. You ever thought, well, I can play in time when I play with the band, but when I'm playing alone, I can't stay in time. This is really evident when a certain player has to play the beginning of a song all by themselves, a solo intro or an outro or a solo fill. When there's no one else playing, it's all you. And these tend to be the parts of the songs that where things go off track. This is when the tempo gets altered. Some like practicing with background tracks instead of metronomes. They feel better, right? They're fun. It's more comfortable to jam over, but they don't always give you the information you need to get better rhythm. These are clips of songs, and they could have a lot of players on them. They can be so dense. There's so much going on those background tracks that you can't hear where the exact beat lies. You're just following along with multiple performers, and they themselves may be playing off the beat, maybe even on purpose, just to get a certain feel for the song. And if you didn't know that, you wouldn't be sure where to place your notes. To know how to have great timing, you need to be specific where the actual beat is. And once you're solid in playing at many different speeds and you have a strong sense of time, you can start to do something pretty cool. You can start to manipulate the beat. You can intentionally place your notes around the main beat in different ways, but without changing it. And this is different than rushing or dragging, because with those, the actual song is changed. The tempo of the song is slowed down or sped up. But with what we're talking about now, the main beat's going to stay the same, but you're going to offset your notes a little bit. They're either ahead of the beat slightly to give a sense of excitement and anticipation, or they're behind the beat a little bit to give a relaxed, loose sound, but the song is still driving ahead in time. This is also a good time to talk about groove. What's groove? You hear groove a lot. What's the groove in a piece of music? It's the decisions to offset some of the timing of the notes you're playing, or possibly leaving others perfectly on the beat. Mixing and matching the timing of notes in a phrase, it can be really cool. It can give us distinctive rhythmic sound, which is a groove. When you've practiced with a metronome and you have command of where you can place a note or place a chord relative to the guide beat, you can start to make your own grooves with these kind of decisions. How do you use a metronome in your practice? We're going to start using a metronome just to help you practice moving from one thing to another in time. Changing chords is the big one for the new players. We've all had the problem of not having enough time to switch between our chords. Once you understand where the beat falls, you can start to think ahead. You can start to anticipate when you need to have that new chord play. Not concentrate so much on where your fingers go, but when you need to have it all finished. And then you can give yourself the time ahead of time that's needed to stay on beat. Do the changing of the chords earlier, maybe in beat 4 of the measure before, so that when you come in on 1, that chord's right there. Using a metronome is important when you practice single notes in a scale as well. And these are commonly practiced 8th notes, 16th notes. If you remember from before, this is prime rushing territory. These places tend to speed up. Scales always seem to rush. And using a metronome will train your brain to stay on time when you have to play lots of fast consecutive notes. When you're first playing strumming patterns, just getting started, it's really difficult to start breaking these rhythms down. I know I'm going through, I have 2 students that I'm thinking about right now, and they know who they are, that we've been going through this. We're breaking down the rhythms to see what down or what upstroke you need to play on a certain beat, or half or a quarter of a beat in between the beats. The metronome can help you with this. It can be like an audible graph paper that makes it very clear how much time you have to fit in your down and up strokes before you move on. The next way to use a metronome is to practice playing at faster speeds cleanly and correctly. First, whatever phrase or whatever you're playing, make sure you're able to play it at a easy tempo, a moderate tempo. You're able to play it correctly. 2, then you start to bump up the beats per minute. At some speed, your picking doesn't seem to be able to keep up. You crank it up, crank it up, crank it up, and you start to feel where it seems difficult to impossible to play what you did just a few beats per minute slower. And this is your number. This beats per minute is your number. This is where we're going to focus our practicing to play faster and cleaner. It's easy. You just back it off a little bit by 1 or 2 beats per minute. Back to where you're comfortable again to practice. Play that. And then after a day or 2, when you're really solid there, bump up 1 or maybe 2 notches on your metronome a little bit faster. The difference is going to be so slight that you most likely won't notice it. And practice it there for a few days until you're comfortable. And then you repeat. Keep speeding it up every few days just by a very small amount. We're going to start to fool ourselves into speeding up over time. It works. It's worked for a long time. It will work for you. The other great benefit of practicing with a metronome is to practice playing at slow speeds. Very slow speeds are so much harder to play than fast speeds. Think of it. At fast speeds, there's between beat 1 and beat 2. If you're playing very fast and you're off time, you're still pretty close to the beat because the time between each beat is small. You're close, even if you're wrong, you're close to a beat, right? But the slower the speed, the wider that goes out, the more time in between beat 1 and beat 2. And the more time you have, the more chance of time you have to make an error and to completely lose the beat and train wreck. It's more difficult. Now, to do this, we just are going to take what we did with playing faster and flip it. Do the opposite of our speed practice. First, we're going to find a slow tempo that you're playing and you're comfortable with. Then we'll slow it down a little bit more until you start guessing where the next beat will come in. It's so slow, there it was, right? You missed it. At that point, you crank it up a little bit, speed it up a little bit till you're comfortable again. And each few days, lower down by 1 or 2 beats per minute. And you will slowly ease yourself into knowing where those beats come in on the slower tempos. Okay, here's our bonus section. We talked about some special metronome exercises that you can play. Let's put this to work. So let's talk about some common exercises to build speed. Number 1, it's the basic chord progression. Take an easy one. I'll give you a basic one right here, but you should use one for one of the current songs you're learning or you're writing, something that you're working on. And you'll play the tempo of the song, see how you're doing. You can record yourself, see how you're doing. If it's good, start there. And every day for a week, bump up the tempo by 1 beats per minute, just like we were talking about. Build yourself up. And when you start struggling, back off 1, give it a few days, start moving forward. That's the basic metronome exercise for chords, but you can do the same thing with your scales. Take pattern 1 C major scale and use this formula for that too. Play along, find where you're comfortable, speed up till you start to get uncomfortable, and then go back 1 or 2, try it again the next day. Another place you should be using a metronome is with technique exercises. What are technique exercises? They're fantastic, and they're not the same as playing scales. You see these 1, 2, 3, 4 is the common one that goes just straight across the neck. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, each on a different string. I see the results of these. They're not really music. They're unmusical exercises. I see them every weekend when I do my coaching videos. When those videos pour in, the first thing we do is technique exercises, and I see the hand strength, picking, accuracy each week get better and better. Why? Because we change them every week. It's an ever-changing combination of technique patterns. So 1, 2, 3, 4. The next week might be 1, 3, 2, 4. Or 4, 3, 2, 1. Change them up. It's great for getting your hands together, helping with hand freeze. You ever felt that? Your hand froze at a certain tempo. It started to cramp up and you had to stop. By taking these small patterns and practicing them for a few minutes and changing them around each week, you start to work on all the different muscles in your hand and your wrist. And then you'll be ready for any weird chord or scale that could maybe twist your hand in an awkward way. So those are the basic ones. Let's talk about using a metronome for something a little bit more advanced. Playing ahead and behind the beat we talked about earlier. If you haven't tried this before, I suggest you do it. It's really fun to try. Just play in something, even quarter notes at first. Just every time you hear the click, play a note. Or just one note at bum, 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 bum. And try to anticipate it by a fraction. Then try to delay it by a fraction. So you're coming in a little bit ahead of the beat, and then later on a little bit behind the beat. You'll start to recognize these sounds. You've heard them in songs before. But some people, they need a visual for this. Some people that just doing it with a metronome may be a little bit of a struggle. To get a great visual of where your beats are coming in, ahead of the beat or behind the beat, you could record to a digital audio workstation, a DAW. And what happens is the DAWs will be broken down to a metronome, but you'll see the waveform. You'll see, and you will be able to see exactly where you hit your note and how much you're ahead or behind the beat. Then you can start to experiment because you now have a visual reference point. and you can work on your quarters, eighths, mix them up, and see exactly where they line up to that grid and find out how good your timing is. Also, once you get confident with placing your rhythms on the beat, you can start filling in those in-between beats yourself, subdividing things. Usually with the metronome, we set it for quarter notes, right? And we play to our quarter notes to a click. Every time there's a quarter note, right on the click. But how about instead of setting the metronome to click every quarter note, just have it on the first beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. So the click only happens on 1. This is really tough to do the first time you do it. And you will know as soon as the next measure comes around if you did it correctly or not. Because if you're off beat, you won't be back in time for the click on that second measure. You can also use the same technique to practice triplets as well, playing in threes, dividing each quarter note into 3 parts, and then coming in on the 1 of the next measure. That will take some time. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. And then there's your next click. So you're placing all of those triplets in a measure, and all you're hearing is the first beat of the measure. Really tough to do at first, but really great for setting your internal time. And finally, when you're feeling confident, you can try playing behind the beat with quarter notes, but you're still only hearing the first click of each measure. Infinitely more difficult because you're messing with the beat of what you're playing, but then you still have to come in on the solid beat of the song. Okay, there we go. My task for you this week is to get started with the metronome. Put it front and center in your practice space and start playing your chord progressions and your songs with it. Find your number, find that place that you struggle with, back it off a little bit, and start to bump it up over time. And while you're there, while you're in your practice space, make sure you download my guide to clear sounding chords. It's over at playguitaracademy.com/chord guide. And we will get those chords together and clear up the rhythms all at the same time in 1 week. Okay. That's it for today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm going to call it that's a wrap. Thank you for joining me today for the Play Guitar Podcast. Make sure to hit the button below to subscribe to the show. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the notification bell so you can get all of my content as soon as it comes out. For more episodes, lessons, and ways to get involved with the Play Guitar community, visit playguitaracademy.com. Thanks again, and I will see you on the next episode.